One of the men that came and talked to my students was a son of somebody who survived the Holocaust, and his father had survived, but also his uncle. And his uncle had survived in an absolutely incredible way. Most of the people who survived say that it was a matter of luck more than anything else. And he was really lucky in the sense that he had been put into the gas chamber. The door had been shut, the whole bit, and everybody's in there crying and upset. And then suddenly the door opened, and a guard had been hurt. And so the guards were looking in saying, "Is anybody in here a doctor?" Well, his uncle had quickly said, "Yes, yes, I'm a doctor," even though he wasn't. And he was taken out, and he did what he could to minister to the guard who had been hurt. And in the confusion, he was not put back into the gas chamber that day or any day, so he survived. The second story I'm going to tell is Hinda Keyboard. Now, Hinda Keyboard is a lady from Medina, and I've taught her grandchildren, and she was in Lithuania during the war. And when the Germans invaded Lithuania, she and her family actually were happy because they thought, "Oh, this is good. They will free us from the Russians who had taken over Lithuania." And she was away at school. She was in college. When she came home, she found her family all in an uproar because her father had been taken to Gestapo headquarters. And she said, "Well, I'm going to go get him back." And everybody's saying, "No, no, you can't, you can't." And she said, "Well, I'm going to." And so she went to Gestapo headquarters, and she insisted on seeing the person in charge, the commandant. And when she saw him, she spoke in very good German, and she politely asked that her father be returned to her. And he was so impressed that she could speak German so well that he said, "Well, yes, of course, then I will return your father. Since you speak my language and you ask so politely, I will return your father." Well, she went home and told everybody, and they thought she was fevered and crazy, and so they laid her down with a cold cloth on her head. And she, the father came back the next day, and everything was fine. Well, then they were all taken, and so in this case the men were separated from the women, and she was put in a work detail. And so for 3 years she worked digging anti-tank trenches, and they were having all sorts of trouble with this one woman who just would not stop talking about food, and she was driving them all nuts because they didn't have any food. So finally what they decided was that they would each take turns teaching something while they were digging these anti-tank ditches. And so the woman could talk about food 1 day a week when it was her turn. And from this, Hinda learned to be a very, very good cook when she actually had food to cook. And Hinda taught people different languages because I believe by the time I knew her, she knew 7 or 8 languages. Well, she gets to the end and she's talking about how there were all sorts of choiceless choices. She was in a camp, and her sister was quite ill. And the inmates of the camp were told they could either choose to stay or leave. Well, she didn't know what that meant. Does that mean I leave and I get killed? If I stay, do I get killed? And so she just said, "Well, okay, we'll stay because my sister's sick and she can't walk very far." Well, after everybody else left, they were there for about a day. And then suddenly the guards rounded everybody up and said, "You're going to walk, schnell, march, you're going to march along." And so they were marching along the road, and suddenly they came to an open field, and the guards started yelling and screaming and telling them to run. So she started to run, and she's pulling her sister along, and her mother realized what was going on, and she turned around, and instead of running away from the guards, she ran toward the guards and basically shielded her children with her body because the guards shot and they killed her mother. And it was a massacre. They killed everybody they could in the field. Well, Hinda and her sister got away, and they were then looking for, they hid, and they went to the nearest town, and they went to the Catholic Church thinking that if anybody would help them, it would be the Catholic Church. And they got there, and the priest was yelling at them, "Get out of here, you're endangering everybody," and so he turned them away. Well, they went outside of town, and they found a barn, and they found a woman who had been there with them, and they said, "Oh, we need to find our way back to the place where the slaughter took place. Maybe our mother's alive." And the woman had been shot through the shoulder and then through the neck and face, and the bullet went all the way up and through and out the side of her head. And she said, no, I stayed, and I was shot, and they left me for dead. And so that's what happened. And so they did that. And then they were hiding in this barn, and she said, well, the cow didn't mind. And so they were hiding there, and they were cuddled up against the cow, and Hinda said it was the warmest she'd been all winter. And in the morning, there was a battle going around the barn, and so she's hearing German voices, and there's bullets flying, and she's lying flat on the ground in the barn, trying to stay alive. And then finally, they started to hear Russian voices, and so they came out, and she was liberated. And she said, oh, this should have been the happiest day of my life, but it was the saddest because my mother had been died the day before I was liberated. And she literally had nothing. Now, for years, whenever they had done a strip search and they'd made her get naked and stand there and search her, she had stuck pictures of her family in between her fingers and then held her fingers tightly closed, just flat. And so she couldn't have them in her hand because she couldn't make a fist, but she held them flat. And then one time they had her stand with her arms out to her side, and they made her open her fingers. And when she did, all the pictures of her family fell down, and she lost even that. So as she was standing there, and the Russians are taking her back to the Soviet Union, and she doesn't want to go to the Soviet Union, but she has no choice. They're liberating her, they're taking her back there. She has her sick sister and the clothes she's standing in. And Hinda Keyboard says that, all I had was my education and my will to live. And so she did start over again in the Soviet Union, and Jewish people were not treated well in the Soviet Union because they were going with the idea that there should be no God and no religion. And the Jewish people were hanging on to their religion, and so there was a lot of prejudice and persecution of Jews. And so eventually Hinda becomes part of the underground in the Soviet Union, and she helps people escape from the Soviet Union. In fact, she's one of the people that went over the border in the middle of the night with guards shooting and the whole bit. And she eventually came to, I believe, Canada and then to the United States. And so she did that. And the last thing I want to mention is that when people were liberated from the camps, sometimes they simply didn't have the strength to go on. And so there was a man that I know whose father was liberated, but he was given a can of condensed milk, and he simply didn't have the strength to get it open. And so he's lying there on the ground, dying from starvation when he's got food in his hand, and he can't get it open. And eventually a soldier found him and took him and put him inside, and then didn't open the can because he knew that eating something that rich would kill him. Instead gave him a little broth at a time. And what they found was that when people would first go into the camps and they'd throw in candy or energy bars or food or anything like that, it would literally kill some of the people. That much calories, that much sugar in one shot after not having food at all for such a long time literally could kill them. And conscientious objectors in the University of Minnesota did their service to their country by allowing themselves to be starved almost to death. And they could then track and see what did happen to people. They had hallucinations, they weren't able to think, they couldn't walk, they had all these things. And they learned how to bring them back to life by feeding them just a tiny bit at a time of very weak broth until they got enough energy and their stomachs got used to the idea of food again, and they could start again.